Dr. Mary Murphy. Dr. Murphy's presentation is sponsored by the Association for Psychological Science. Dr. Murphy is a professor in the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences at Indiana University, where she's the class of 1948 Herman B. Wells Endowed Professor. She received her undergraduate degree from the University of Texas, which I have to mention because I also was an undergraduate at the University of Texas, hook 'em horns. Okay, and she received her PhD from Stanford University. At Indiana University, she directs the Mind in Identity and Context Lab, examining how people's social identities interact with social contexts to influence people's thoughts, feelings, and motivations. She has a forthcoming book in March, Cultures of Growth, How the New Science of Mindset Can Transform Individuals, Teams, and Organizations. So as I say, that will be published in March. Today, she will address us on the topic, Creating Growth Mindset Cultures in Our Classrooms. Please welcome Dr. Murphy.
Thank you. All right. Good morning. I'm so pleased to be with you. I want to thank Steve and the organizing committee for inviting me to be here and to share some of the work we've been doing over the last decade on growth mindset. Can I just see, these are my people, psychology teachers. How many people have heard of growth mindset? Yay, everybody pretty much. Maybe not everybody, but most people. So I'm going to tell you, I think, for sure, about at least a few developments in the world of growth mindset and some things that are brand new out of our lab that really show how we might have been misinterpreting growth mindset and what we can do about that as we go forward, both in our teaching and also in practice as we engage with students. Let's see. So I'd like to start with a quote from my PhD advisor, Claude Steele. And I think this kind of sets the tone for what I want to share with you today. And I will note that I only plan to talk for about 45 minutes, maybe 50 minutes, with a substantial amount of time for questions. So please do feel free to ask questions, and we'll have a mic going around. So Claude said in 1997, he said, from an observer's standpoint, the situations of a boy and a girl in a math classroom or of a black student and a white student in any classroom are essentially the same. The teacher's the same, the textbooks are the same, and in better classrooms, these students are treated the same. Is it possible then that they should still experience the classroom differently? So differently, in fact, as to significantly affect their performance and achievement there? This is the central question. And one of the ways in which we know that students experience the classroom differently is around their mindset. So mindset is this idea, for those who haven't heard of it, developed originally by Carol Dweck in the late 1970s after she did a lot of work actually on animal behavior and learned helplessness, looking at how different animals respond to situations where they're in learned helplessness kind of context and what actually creates motivation and engagement, and then applying that to children and then later adults. And so the growth mindset has often been talked about in comparison to the fixed mindset. So the growth mindset holds that intelligence, ability, talent is something that can be developed. Individuals with a growth mindset understand that these things can be developed with hard work, effective strategies, seeking help. And this is contrasted with that idea of the fixed mindset, that you either have it or you don't. You're a math person or you're an arts person, right? Those are kinds of ideas around, I'm just bad at math. Those are ideas that are really more fixed-minded. Now, what we know is that if you Google mindset, the fixed mindset and the growth mindset, you go to Google Images, you're going to see a lot of things like this. It's often two heads. With fixed and growth mindset, you can tell which one is the wrong one. You can tell which one is the right one, right? And all of the kinds of outcomes that have been associated with fixed and growth mindset across the years, in the 30 years or so that this has really been studied. So I can learn anything I want to, or I'm either good at it or I'm not. Tell me I'm smart. Tell me that I try hard. So I call this mindset 1.0 in a lot of ways. I think as mindset has moved into particularly teacher education programs and others, this is really how it's been distilled and taught. The reason I call it the old way of thinking about mindset is because you can see even in the graphic, it's asking you, what kind of mindset do you have? Like you gotta pick one, right? And you know which one's the right one and which one's the wrong one, right? Which is ironically a very fixed way of thinking about the fixed mindset, right, and the growth mindset. Pick one or the other. Also, it's located in the mind only, right? It's part of the brain and it's located within individuals. And I'm gonna show you why in a moment that is not really all there is to it when it comes to mindset. So a better way of thinking about mindset, what I call mindset 2.0, is really going back to the way mindset has always been measured and studied in the literature. It's always been measured on a Likert scale, right? That there's range. And we know from experimental studies that we can inhabit both our fixed and our growth mindset in different contexts at different times. We all have both mindsets, and we move between them based on situational cues in our environment, right? So I can be very fixed-minded about the way I want the dishwasher to be set up, and I can be very growth-minded, right, about the way that I'm gonna give feedback to my niece or my nephew, right, when they're struggling to learn something. And so this is a better way of thinking about mindset. Instead of the two heads, it's on a continuum, the mindset continuum, and we all have both. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how we move between our fixed and growth mindset based on our learning context and what we as culture creators, as instructors and teachers, actually can do to move students more often towards the growth mindset based on our teaching practices. But most importantly, what's different about Mindset 2.0 is really understanding that contextual nature of mindset. We know now that individual mindset is not enough. How do we know this? I'm going to show you a recent study we conducted in which we looked at the extent to which individual directed mindset programs that are meant to move students towards their growth mindset more of the time actually don't work. So in the very, very large study with over 12,000 high school students in a nationally representative sample, we took the typical mindset intervention programs that have been developed by Carol Dweck and her colleagues. We distilled that message into an online module. We sent it over the internet, and we were looking at the impact of these programs on students' grades, and also because the theory is that it affects motivation and persistence on their course-taking patterns across time. And what happened? Well, replicating previous growth mindset interventions, we did see a small but statistically significant impact on both students' GPA and their willingness to take more advanced, more difficult STEM courses across their high school term. But most importantly, we looked at and pre-registered where we didn't think it would work from a theoretical perspective. Where doesn't this kind of direct-to-student mindset intervention fall apart? And where we found it was that we thought with teacher mindset and teacher practices, the intervention had zero effect when faculty endorsed more fixed mindset beliefs about their students' abilities, and when they engaged in more fixed-minded practices. We're going to talk about what some of those look like in a moment. And it had a larger impact, the intervention to students had a larger impact in the context of growth-minded instructors and growth-minded teaching practices. It also mattered as to the culture in the local environment as created and constituted by the peer group. We found that when students were unsupportive of learning and development, the direct-to-student mindset intervention had no impact, had very small impact. However, when they were surrounded by a culture set up by the instructor that really had students engaging in more challenge-seeking behaviors and engaging in enjoying learning and development, making mistakes, the intervention had a much larger impact. So this idea that we can just go in and change students' mindsets, in my view, it's problematic for a couple of different reasons, right? First of all, it says the students are the problem, fix them, just change your mindset. What's wrong with you? Don't you just have a growth mindset? And also, right, it doesn't take into consideration these situational cues, this context, both created by instructors as well as the peer group surrounding our students. So how do we take this and other work that we've done and actually theorize and think about it over time? And for the last 10 years, we've been studying what I've been calling mindset culture. And this is what I call mindset 3.0, right? Sort of the development of mindset. First from inside the head, the false dichotomy of it, then on a continuum, and now as part of a cultural feature. And so what do I mean when I say mindset culture? I'm mostly talking about the beliefs of powerful people in a setting, people like us, teachers, professors. In a workplace environment, it would be supervisors or bosses, people who direct and mentor others, and what they believe, what we believe, about students' talents and abilities. And just like we're not going to go back to that false dichotomy of the fixed and growth mindset, right? Faculty or instructor or teacher mindset also exists on a continuum, where sometimes we can really believe the idea that talent or ability is stable. It can't change very much. I know the students that are going to struggle. If they struggle early, they're often going to struggle across the term. Or we can be shifted into our growth mindset, where we think that students' talent and ability is a potential that can be developed. Now, how do I know if I'm in more of a fixed or a growth mindset cultural context at any given moment? In this Psychology 101 course, or in my social psych or developmental or neuroscience course? Well, we look at the cultural artifacts within that learning environment. So we are looking at what instructors are saying and doing, what are our norms, our policies, our practices, how we actually interact with students, both when we're teaching and also in our one-on-one interactions, in office hours and mentoring, in our laboratories. And so we have seen some of these cues. Across time, we've published around these ideas that instructors can communicate and create the mindset culture of their class. Let me give you some examples. So pre-pandemic, we went around to 65 introductory gateway STEM courses, including psychology. NSF calls psychology a STEM course, or STEM discipline. And we went around to these 65 instructional classes, and we video recorded faculty teaching. We measured their mindset beliefs, and we measured students' perceptions of their faculty's mindset, and we measured student experience. I'm going to show you some of that data. But right now, I'm going to show you what some of the cues were in those classrooms that really signaled that we were in a more fixed or growth mindset context. So though this was the year 2019, right before the pandemic, I still found 5 out of 65 classes where on the first day of class, I was hearing some version of look to your left, look to your right, only one of you is going to be here at the end of the term, right? Still, right? Here we are, year of our Lord, 2019. We also heard language like this. If you're not a science person, you should consider dropping this class, right? These are cues that we hypothesized would make students start to wonder whether they or people like them, maybe those who aren't quote unquote naturally good at science, right, whatever that means, maybe don't belong here, right? That was our hypothesis. Whereas on the other hand, we saw a lot of instructors engaging in more growth-minded behaviors, especially there at the beginning of the course when you're sort of telling students what to expect across time. So things like this course builds on material from Psych 101. If you need to review these concepts, we can connect you to resources, meaning that if you haven't mastered the basics yet, right, we're going to put you in terms of some resources that are going to help you learn. So learning is something you can develop. Also, it's normal to be challenged by material at some point in the term. When that happens, I'm your partner in learning, please reach out to me for some help. Simply saying that really communicated faculty's belief and instructors' beliefs on students' abilities to learn and develop. And our hypothesis was that students then, in a classroom like this, would believe that the instructor thinks that all students can learn, grow, and develop across the course. So how might instructors' mindsets actually influence students' experiences and performance. We had a couple of hypotheses, not necessarily competing hypotheses, but hypotheses that we wanted to explore. The first hypothesis was that maybe a growth mindset culture would be beneficial for everyone and a fixed mindset culture would be harmful for everyone. That is, that it would affect all students' engagement and performance to the same level. If you look at the 30 years of mindset research at the individual level, you'll be hard-pressed to find a lot of places where the fixed mindset is actually beneficial. There are a few, but very few. And so you could just hypothesize that a growth mindset culture is going to lift all boats, right? It's going to be helpful for everybody. But we also had another hypothesis coming out of some of my work earlier with Claude Steele on stereotype threat and these other ideas, which was that we thought that mindset culture could have even stronger impacts for students who belong to groups that are negatively stereotyped along the dimensions of ability and intelligence. If mindset is whether you have intelligence and ability or not, perhaps a growth mindset and fixed mindset culture matter more for students who belong to these groups negatively stereotyped along those dimensions. So in the American context, it's going to be groups like Black students, Latinx students, Native American students, first-generation students, low-income students, and in STEM contexts, women students as well. So our theory was really trying to get into the minds of students and perceiving the classroom and learning environment from students' perspective. So from students' perspective, if I have an instructor who seems to suggest, either in the introductory lecture, in their syllabus, in their practices and policies, that STEM abilities are fixed, right? Mental rotation, well, you're either good at it or you're not. Computational abilities, good at it or you're not, right? Some people are just naturally skilled. If we communicate those ideas to students, that these abilities are fixed, they can't be changed, you either have them or you don't, we hypothesized that students will make an inference that there are certain groups who are thought to have those fixed abilities, right? Based on our cultural stereotypes that exist in society. Who are those groups that have these natural STEM abilities? Well, oftentimes they're white students, often white men. Sometimes some Asian groups are positively stereotyped as having more STEM ability. And so we hypothesized that students would think their instructor believes this idea, that white and maybe Asian men have more ability in these contexts than Black, Latinx, Native students, as well as women in STEM. Now, if you're a student and instead of a fixed mindset instructor, you have what you perceive as a growth mindseted instructor, that instructor is communicating these ideas, that STEM abilities are malleable, that you can improve as long as you're engaged in these growth-minded behaviors, like asking questions, seeking help when you're stuck, that those abilities can be improved with effort and learning across the term. We hypothesized that students would then make an inference about that instructor, that instructor would believe that as long as students from any group puts in the effort and adopts the strategies, that all students can be successful in this course. So ultimately, what we were hypothesizing was that perceiving a STEM instructor to endorse more of a fixed mindset would create a context of stereotype threat, putting some students from those groups that are negatively stereotyped along these dimensions of ability at risk of confirming those negative ability stereotypes in that context. How would we know that these fixed mindset cultures create a context of stereotype threat? We should see the same kind of effects that you see in the stereotype threat literature, but more so in the fixed mindset context and less so in the growth mindset context. And that would oftentimes be seen as performance differences between underrepresented racial and ethnic minority students relative to their white and perhaps some Asian group students. So this is one of the first studies that we did. This is one of the largest first studies we did, I should say. This was an entire institution, university context. We had all 150 STEM instructors. We measured their self-reported mindset beliefs about their students' abilities. And then we looked longitudinally at their entire courses across 7 semesters. They taught 602 courses, reaching over 15,000 students at this institution across time. And what we found consistent with that first hypothesis I mentioned, was at first a main effect, right? What we found was that students generally on average performed worse in classes taught by faculty who self-reported more fixed mindset beliefs, here in the dark blue, relative to students who were in classrooms where faculty self-reported more growth mindset beliefs about their students. But also, consistent with that second stereotype threat hypothesis, we found that the racialized outcome gap, in this case, end of the course grade, was twice as large in courses taught by faculty who self-reported more fixed mindset beliefs. Now, of course, when you look at an interaction, you can look at it a couple of different ways. For someone who's often studied how to create identity-safe settings, I often see this kind of achievement gap in many STEM courses between racial ethnic minority students and majority students. So this size of this effect was not so surprising to me. What was surprising to me was how much just having an instructor who self-reported more of a growth mindset, in some ways, halved the racialized outcome gap at the end of the course, right? So how much this actually mattered for students, that to me was what was somewhat surprising here. This kind of impact is what you see typically, and this is, to me, what's different. So we wanted to know, what is it like from students' perspectives to be a student in these more fixed or growth-minded classroom contexts? Well, we had 602 classes, 150 instructors. How are we going to look at this across time, all measuring the same outcome? We had course evaluations. And at this institution, there are 5 basic questions that are asked across every course. You can always add and change some of the questions, but these 5 are kind of the same questions across time. So we looked at how students report experiencing these particular classes. So how much did the instructor motivate you to do your best work? Students reported being more motivated in the context where faculty self-reported more growth mindset beliefs for students. How much did the instructor emphasize learning and development across the term of the semester? Well, faculty with more growth-minded beliefs emphasized more learning and development according to students. How likely would you be to recommend this course with this instructor? Again, an impact. And then finally, the place where we didn't find an effect was that compared to other courses you've taken, how much time did this course require and how rigorous was this course? So from students' perspective, they actually didn't perceive a statistically significant difference between fixed and growth-minded courses when it came to the time they had to develop in it and the amount of rigor that they experienced from the course. So just to summarize, what's it like to be a student? Growth mindset instructors emphasize learning and development, motivate their students to do their best work, and yet from students' perspective, these courses are equally time-intensive and rigorous. But we wanted to go deeper into this. We wanted to actually measure students' psychological experiences. This is psychology, right? Psychological experiences in these classroom settings, more than just at the end of the term, the evaluation, which we know can be problematic for many different reasons, right? So now let's actually look at students' experiences. So with this team of students and colleagues, we did a study looking at using a method called experience sampling in STEM classrooms. We had over 1,000 first and second year college students enrolled in our study. Those students themselves were enrolled in more than 50 introductory STEM courses, including psychology, across 4 university contexts. And what we did here was we had students report their perceived mindset beliefs now, rather than faculty self-reports, now students' perceptions of their instructors' mindset beliefs by filling out a modified version of Carol Dweck's validated mindset scales. Things like the professor, or if they were in a section that was being taught by a TA, the TA in this course seems to believe that some students have a certain amount of intelligence and they can't really do much to change it. It was a 4-item measure. Then we developed an app tuned to students' particular courses and their course schedule that particular term of participation, and they got a notification to complete a survey, a very brief survey, after every course that they were in at the end of that course. And we only counted the survey when it was completed within 10 minutes of the end of their class, so we don't get a lot of retrospective memory bias kind of built into that response, those responses. And we measured things like students' negative affect, their sense of belonging in the class, whether they felt like they were an imposter or not, and their evaluative concerns. So we ended up with over 7,000 surveys, and of course we're doing multi-level modeling because students are nested within courses, within universities, and so that's the analysis we did, but I'm just going to show you the bottom line process model results that we found from this study. So here we found that when students perceive their instructor to endorse more fixed mindset beliefs, they experience greater psychological vulnerability in that particular instructor's course. And that included lower sense of belonging, greater evaluative concerns, greater imposter feelings, and more negative affect. Now, you all are psychologists and or teachers of psychology, and so you care about this kind of thing, psychology measures, but a lot of people are like, why the psychology? It's too mushy, too soft, like, why do we care about that? and so, we also look at things, we care about this because it predicts really important things that everybody cares about, including engagement in the course. We looked at how much effort students self-reported putting in, their attendance, and their dropout intentions, and perceiving an instructor to endorse more fixed mindset beliefs led to greater psychological vulnerability, which in turn affected these course engagement measures. It also affected their motivation and interest in STEM. And what was interesting here was it wasn't just the interest in this class, this Psych 101 class, or that Chem 101 class, or this Bio 101 class, but it also generalized to that instructor's discipline. So that meant that they were less likely then to take additional courses in the psychology pathway or in a biology-related pathway and these sorts of course-taking outcomes. And then finally, replicating the previous study, we found that this psychological vulnerability related to faculty's perceived mindset affected students' course performance at the end of the term in these professors' courses. So the question then becomes a question of practice, right? What are instructors actually saying and doing that communicate their mindset belief to students? How can I use this tomorrow, right? Or when we get back from the conference, as we go back into the classroom, what can I say and do to create more of a growth mindset culture than a fixed mindset culture? And how is that going to be perceived by students? Because we can say we believe certain things, and maybe we do believe certain things, but I would say that oftentimes we see from the data that faculty's self-reported mindset beliefs and their practices don't often align. And what matters most for students in terms of their perception and their psychological experience and their performance is what we say and do, not necessarily what we privately believe. So to get to this question of what instructors can say and do to communicate more fixed or growth mindset cultural messages to students across the term, we engaged in a method called mouse tracking from the social cognition literature. And this was done with my former graduate student, who's now an instructor at Sacred Heart University, Katie Kroper, and one of our undergraduate honors thesis students, Audrey Fried. So here, what this study involves is that first, students engaged in a learning module to understand what the fixed and growth mindset is. So everyone has similar information about what a fixed and a growth mindset is at a high level. After they learn about that and take a comprehension quiz to make sure we know everybody knows and is defining fixed and growth mindset in similar ways, then students engaged in a categorization task. And we had these poor students having to categorize 119 behaviors and statements that were sourced from those videos that I mentioned that we took, actually observing faculty and instructors teaching, as well as focus groups where we had students come in and tell us whether or not they thought they've ever had a fixed or growth mindseted instructor, one who seemed more fixed or more growth, and then what did they say and do. So we had these behaviors both from the literature, from our own behavioral observations, and from focus groups, and that's how we got 119. And in the paper of this, there's all 119 behaviors listed back there, so in the appendix. So you can sort of see, and you can see how students categorize them. So from students' perspective, here is what the study looks like, right? They see a cue, like the professor offers additional practice problems, and then the mouse is located there at the center of the screen, and they have to then say whether or not, in their mind, this is a more growth-minded practice, or is this a more fixed mindset message or practice. And if their trajectory of their mouse, as they move it from the center straight over to growth-minded, right, this suggests little uncertainty. It's easy to categorize. Right away, go straight over to growth mindset, right? But the benefit of using this kind of method is that we can also look at different kinds of trajectories where there might be a little bit more uncertainty. Well, maybe I start maybe thinking it's somewhere in the middle, but then ultimately I decide it's growth-minded, right? This shows that it's more difficult to categorize for students. Maybe it's a little bit of a mixed cue. And here, right, this is called X-flips. Right, a lot more uncertainty, much more difficult to categorize. And so we can really understand more about how students are perceiving these different mindset cues and practices and what we say and do, and how they categorize them. So what were the results? Well, we pre-registered our predictions about which of these practices, based on the literature, based on the focus groups, which ones would be categorized as more growth-minded and which would be categorized as more fixed-minded. And we pre-registered those predictions before we looked at the data and conducted the analysis. And what you will see here is that we kind of know some things, right? Like, these numbers are pretty high in regards to our predictions and whether or not those predictions were what students sort of said were more fixed or growth-minded cues. So that's kind of good, right? We know from the literature is helpful in helping us to predict this. So let's look at what some of these cues are. So here we have the growth categorization scale going from fixed to growth, and then you have cues that we predicted were either going to be more fixed-minded cues up here at the top, cues that we were unsure as to whether or not they'd be more fixed or growth-minded, or mixed cues, and more growth-minded cues. So let's look at the cues that we both predicted were going to be more growth-minded, and from the green dots you can see that students really saw themselves as much more growth-minded, easier to categorize, quickly to categorize these cues as growth-minded. What are they? Well, the professor tries different ways of explaining the course material to ensure that all students understand. If you think that students either get it or you don't do a lot of explaining and re-explaining and making sure students are coming along in their learning, right, across the course of the term. So this really communicated to students that the instructor held more growth-minded beliefs about students' abilities. The professor encourages students to email questions so they can improve their understanding. And they say things like, mistakes are opportunities to learn. What are the most fixed-minded cues that we saw students categorizing as fixed-minded? The professor encourages struggling students to drop the class, right? Now, we might do this for several different reasons. We might think that, if a student has really bombed that first exam and there's almost no chance because of the way our instruction and our grades are set up that they're not going to be able to come back, we might be doing it for certain reasons. But from students' perspective, we are communicating more of a fixed mindset belief about those students, right? So doing that kind of practice, look to your left, look to your right, was one of those. Saying at the beginning of the term, not all students are capable of doing well in my class. This is a hard class. I'm a notoriously tough instructor. These kinds of things we're communicating more fixed-minded beliefs. And then things that are more structural, like not holding regular office hours because the instructor seems to believe that extra time is going to do little to help students in the class, or not being present when we have office hours and students come and it's a closed door, right? Those were things that we saw as communicating more of a fixed mindset belief. You either have it or you don't need these office hours. And then finally, telling struggling students, kind of backhanded compliments maybe, or like encouraging words, things like, oh, it's okay, you're just not a math person, right? Though we might mean that to actually relieve some of the anxiety and concern people have, particularly in courses like statistics that really involve some math or certain cognition and neuroscience courses that involve a lot of math. We hear this often, but it's communicating to students more of these fixed-minded beliefs. So the takeaways: messages that prioritize grades and suggest intellectual ability as natural and static are going to be categorized as more fixed-minded. Those that prioritize student learning and suggest, either explicitly or implicitly, that ability can improve were categorized as growth-minded. And in line with other good teaching practices like transparency, TILT, right, transparency in teaching and learning, we found that when instructors provide their reasons for why they have the practices or engage in what they're saying and doing, these messages are easier for students to categorize, right? So rather than just, I try different ways of explaining the course material, saying I try different ways of explaining the course material to ensure all students understand, right? You're saying that I want students to really engage in that learning process. And so that makes those categorizations much more straightforward and quick for students to be able to categorize as fixed or growth-minded. So to summarize this up, when instructors suggest or explicitly communicate, everyone can learn, offer opportunities for practice and feedback, respond to struggling students with support, and place value on learning, students perceive instructors as having more of a growth mindset. All these slides are going to be available, by the way. I see some people taking pictures, but we're going to make them all available. So to summarize here, what we have seen is that when learning environments communicate that instructors and institutions have a growth mindset about intelligence for students, students feel more supported, they feel like they fit in, they trust. We have a lot of data on trust, actually, in different studies. Trust the instructors and the people at the institution more. They're less worried about being treated as a stereotype, and they perform better. So what can instructors and institutions do? I'm going to tell you about a large-scale intervention that we did that is instructor-focused and looking at how that impacted student experience and student outcomes in these courses. And our answer is really address the mindset culture. So this is the Student Experience Project. You can go to the website studentexperienceproject.org and learn all about it. All of the tools and resources that we used in this study to help support instructors to create more growth mindset cultures are freely available and accessible to you. So you can just go to our website. You can go also to Equity Accelerator, and I'll show that at the end as well for all of the resources we used to help instructors do this better. But let's start at the top with the theory of change. So based on all of that work I showed you previously, our theory was simply that when instructors can create more growth-minded cultures in their classroom, this is going to affect students' experiences with learning, their belonging, their imposter feelings, their evaluative concerns, their affect in class, and that is going to impact their performance and their retention across course pathway taking. So the setup for this study was quite intense. You'll see why in a moment, but it involved a lot of different organizations, our organization, the Equity Accelerator, as well as many others. All of the campuses that participated were urban serving universities, so they were USU public institutions. You can see them there in the student experience cohort. We also had applications for institutions, and we had 12 other institutions that we couldn't service, but we created these tools and resources and made them available to the peer learning network. And we wanted to know whether instructors could do this without our supports and our kind of like work together in a community of learning. And so we found that they had impact as well, just simply using the resources we created for the project, the knowledge base. So to start this project, what we wanted to do, we had these 6 different campuses, and we wanted to see what were going to be the common ground, the areas of the friction areas where they really wanted to focus. And so we looked at surveys and focus groups. We did institutional data analysis across these institutions, and it won't surprise you that across these institutions, similar kind of problems persisted. that students from structurally disadvantaged racial groups and those with high financial stress were 2 to 3 times more likely to experience identity threat in class than their peers, and they were more likely to have higher DFW rates, particularly in their Gateway STEM courses. So this is where we wanted to focus. That's how we chose Gateway STEM to do this project in. And we created comprehensive reports. We needed to have institutional buy-in from the provost level of these institutions all the way down where these instructors would be honored and praised for participating in this, and whether they would get benefits for doing so. Like some institutions gave a small stipend, some gave a course release, others worked on different kinds of benefits for instructors to be able to engage in this process. So, provosts were glad to have this report and giving them a lot to consider, and then motivating them to really support instructors in doing this institutional transformation work. We also created a measure called the Student Experience Index, SEI, and this was a short measure based on some of the experience sampling work we had previously done that really looked at these 5 aspects of student experience that we know from the literature predict engagement, persistence, and outcomes in higher education. And that consisted of institutional growth mindset, perceiving your instructor to endorse more growth mindseted views, belonging and belonging uncertainty, identity safety, trust and fairness, and self-efficacy. So these had to be very brief measures because we measured them at the end of every course, similar to what we did in the experience sampling study. And this is derived theoretically and from the previous literature. So this study really took a continuous improvement iterative design, where we initially had measures of student experience in each of these instructors, Gateway instructors, STEM courses. Psych 101 would be generally the one in psychology. And we had brief survey at the beginning of the term, and faculty got their own data, broken up by identity group, and I'm going to show you what that looks like in a minute. Then they reviewed that data, and they were able to see where they saw experience gaps for example, men and women students, or students from structurally disadvantaged racial and ethnic minority groups versus more advantaged groups, or students with high or low financial stress. Do they experience belonging gaps? Are they experiencing efficacy gaps? Are they experiencing differences in how they're already coming to perceive me on day 1 as a fixed or growth-minded instructor? Then we created a practice library, and that practice library is what's available to everyone online and freely available, where faculty went to the practice library to learn relevant practices. What can I actually say and do in this moment? I'll show you what some of those practices look like. And then we tracked improvement by measuring student experience across the term, giving that data to instructors. Did that practice actually improve student experience, closing some of those gaps, increasing students' experiences across time? That's what instructors were able to see as they participated across the course of the term. So we had developed this practices library, really taking some of the best evidence that we have in psychology about teaching practices and how to implement those, and creating little modules and tools and resources for instructors to be able to do this. We also engaged in some online skill building workshops where instructors came in very briefly for like 20-minute module workshops about how to do this practice and to hear from other instructors how they were doing it. So they were able to learn together across those 6 institutions, which was really fun for instructors to do. And then here's an example of one of the practices. It's kind of small here, but basically, this at the top says, what is a growth mindset culture? It gives an explanation because a lot of instructors, particularly our physics instructors or our chemistry instructors, might not have ever heard of growth mindset, right? They're not psychology instructors. And then what are the key ingredients for creating a growth mindset culture? What do you say and do? Some examples of what you could say and do to make it authentic from your own perspective. We always have what not to say and do, how this goes awry, because we have seen it go awry in some contexts, and so we always have that as well. And then there's always a checklist where you can think about your new practice and make sure that it has some fidelity to the research base, so you're more confident that that practice is going to be effective in affecting student experience. So again, instructors got their own data from their students. This is an example of what it looked like. This is perceiving that you're in a growth-minded culture. Your instructor endorses growth mindset beliefs. You can see how all students are perceiving it, and then the extent to which you have gaps, for example, among students with low financial stress and students with high financial stress in perceiving that this is a growth-minded environment, right? More wealthy students, those with low financial stress, are perceiving it as a more growth-oriented context than those with a lot of financial stress, for example. And then as faculty engaged in these practices changes, they were able to see how their impact on student experience changed across these cycles. So what were the results? A total of about 300 instructors participated across these 6 institutions, and they had about 10,000 students per term, so we had about 30,000 students in the study altogether. And students sort of come from a mix of backgrounds. Again, these are urban serving universities. What did we find? Number one, every college's team, using these tools and resources, were able to grow student experience, especially along the dimensions of belonging and identity safety, because the practices were really targeting these kinds of disparities in experience. We also saw that some instructors were really good at doing this, particularly for our Black and Latinx students' belonging, improving these students' belonging and identity safety by 20 percentage points or more. And so what we did as a project was we identified from a statistical perspective these positive deviant instructors, and we said, what are you doing? Because you're improving experience by like 2 standard deviations, right? Like above the mean. What are you saying and doing? How are you implementing this practice? Then we took their examples and put it in the resources so that other instructors could actually make use of it and be benefited by those implementations. And then finally, to this point of institutional transformation, we saw that the different campus teams were starting to take this idea of student experience and measuring it with the Student Experience Index and applying it to other ways of improving students' outcomes. So their early alerts, which ones increase belonging and which ones don't, right? Which ones make you feel like an imposter and which ones don't. The design of the physical and virtual space, academic probation messaging, really starting to use our automated tools to actually try A/B testing and seeing which ones actually influence student experience and reduce gaps in students' experiences and outcomes. So to show you this in a statistical kind of way, we found that as we predicted, as faculty were engaged in these change practices, students experienced significant, students' psychological experiences improved across the term. As students' experiences improved, this is the SEI score on the x-axis here, their student experience. As it went from negative experiences to positive experiences across the term, so too the likelihood of them getting an A or B in these Gateway STEM courses at the end of the term, and their likelihood of getting a D, F, or W at the end of the term was also significantly impacted. And then finally, to the question of equity, we saw a benefit for having instructors engaging in these practices for students from all of these groups that we were interested in. Structurally disadvantaged racial and ethnic minority students, women students, students with high financial stress, transfer students, and first-generation students. And each of these differences is statistically significant. This is the difference in earning a DF or W. So, you know, more negative numbers is more positive. That's what you want, a decrease in having a DF or W in the class. But we did see the biggest effects accrue to some underserved groups more than others. For example, we saw a 31% greater impact for Black, Latinx, and Native American students relative to white and Asian peers, and a 43% greater impact for students who are financially stressed relative to those with less financial stress. So taking away what we can learn from this, we really created this to sort of see, you'll notice that this started in the pandemic, right? The first couple of semesters and terms were actually done in that transition to online teaching. And then the last semester and the most previous recent data we have are actually in in-person learning environments. But we wanted to create this, and it was necessary, in a way that everything would be digital and scalable. So from those initial diagnostic tools to the practice library to these continuous assessment of student experience, everything is available for your use if you're interested in thinking about how to adopt this or apply it in your own context. What are we doing now? We're actually conducting an RCT where we're looking at the causal impacts of engaging in these practices across several terms. We're also conducting smaller experiments to look at each individual tool. We know that the toolbox as a total kind of works, but what is the impact of each tool and which are the most impactful tools for student outcomes? That's a question we want to know. That's what we're looking at now. And then we're also moving into community colleges where the most underrepresented students, the highest number of underrepresented students are actually receiving their college education. So we want to understand how those contexts differ from four-year contexts and what are those practices that community college instructors can engage in to communicate more growth-minded cultures. So just to conclude here, growth mindset cultures communicate this idea that intelligence and ability is something that we can develop, right? Through good strategies, persistence, asking questions, and seeking help. And that we, as culture creators, as instructors, who communicate a growth mindset about ability, we can increase students' motivation and engagement, reduce their psychological vulnerability, increase belonging and performance, and create more equitable learning environments. So I see mindset culture as really part of our new Mount Everest in this world of mindset scholarship, right? And even in our identity, safety, and stereotype threat work, thinking about mindset culture as an impact of that. We want to understand more deeply what instructors are saying and doing. We have some idea, but of course we can always think about other things. We also want to think about how instructors can do this sustainably and with fidelity. This is an implementation question. We're taking a lot of cues from our clinical psychology colleagues about implementation science and how to apply that here. We also want to understand whether instructor beliefs need to change in addition to their behavior, or is simply saying and doing these things, even if you don't really privately believe it, is just as effective. We have some initial evidence on that. And then we want to understand how instructor and student mindsets actually interact, because we think the peer context is going to matter as well as what the instructor says and does. We need community to scale it. I hope you will come on board and think about how you might be able to use this. And we have some tools and resources for you to do that. My new book, as Steve mentioned, is coming out in March on this. It's available for pre-order. And then all the tools and resources from the Student Experience Project are available. Thank you so much for listening. I look forward to questions. Good. I think we have time. Anyone have any questions? I think we have a mic. There's a couple questions over here. I'm going to wait for the microphone for accessibility reasons.
Thank you.
Hi.
Yeah, a wonderful talk. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Very inspiring. I'm sure at all of our schools, we're seeing what I'm seeing at our school, and we have data on this, increasing numbers of students coming in with accommodations, with classifications that can act, in my perspective from 35 years of teaching, as very self-defeating labels.
Yeah.
So to me, there's something when I look at the student psychology of their own diagnostic labels, students, I think, are internalizing these really as fixed traits.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering about this, working with that type of population.
Yes.
Okay, some of whom might need more help than anybody else.
Yes.
And just what your thoughts are about that.
That's right, that's right. So the question is really about students more and more needing accommodations or coming in with diagnoses related to learning disabilities or anxiety or other things that make learning difficult, and so need accommodations in the course. And that this might then mean that students are coming in with very fixed ideas about their own abilities, right? I'm not good at this, learning is hard for me, these sorts of things. And how do we deal with that in the context? Because this is more prevalent now than ever. I think that's true. What I would say is that there is some research on students with disabilities and growth mindset and how instructors can actually, even with very severe learning disabilities, a growth mindseted instructor or mentor is really helpful because an instructor who's really growth-minded expects and believes that people can develop, they don't expect them to always have to be at the very top, right, of the distribution. It's just where you are, it's possible to develop further. And I'm going to give you the tools, resources, and skills that you need across time, the supports that you need in order to make that kind of progress over time. It's not that you're sort of Pollyanna and like all students can be at the top of the class, right? That would actually probably come across as a little hypocritical and not true for students. But I do think that the research shows that if we can communicate these abilities and even talk to students when they come to request accommodations, that we have seen that engaging in certain practices, coming to office hours, asking questions, doing the problem sets in advance of the lecture, these are the kinds of learning strategies that really help students with conditions like theirs improve and learn and understand, right? So we're communicating not only the learning strategies, but also our belief and our experience with students like them to be able to grow and learn. These are some of the like specific strategies that I've seen instructors use with students with accommodations that can be very helpful. Now, we see accommodations and the way in which accommodations are described in the syllabus. We have a syllabus review tool as part of the Student Experience Project resources. And we see that the business as usual syllabus usually just has the requisite statement by the institution as to accommodations. And so one of the recommendations we put there is how do you add a sentence or two to that accommodation to actually help students feel like there is hope and that you're happy to provide the accommodation and that, you know, engaging in certain learning strategies will help them in the course. So that is one of the practices that we definitely suggest in the syllabus revision module. Thank you for your question. That's a really important one right now.
Hi there.
Hi.
Thank you very much for your talk. I loved it. I actually came in with my skeptic hat on because of the recent meta-analyses about individual interventions and everything.
Yep.
So I was wondering to get buy-in from other faculty, like the kind of faculty who are not in this room.
Yeah. Right.
What do you recommend?
What do you
whether
recommend
it's-
against the growth mindset is bullshit?
Yeah, what
example?
do you recommend about how to
Yeah.
suggest these kinds of interventions and trainings within your department or your center for teaching excellence and those kinds of things to encourage them and want them to put the work in to see an intervention that will work?
Yeah. Well, I think there are now several papers. Our paper was published in 2022, this one looking at the direct-to-student mindset interventions and showing where it doesn't work. And a large part of that is instructors. And then there's now a very large body of work, too, where you can point people published in places. We've published in Science, we've published in PNAS, you know, very well-respected journals that your colleagues across different areas are going to recognize and understand to show how instructor and faculty mindset, beliefs, and practices actually impact student outcomes. Also for instructors who are more, what would I say? Instrumentally motivated. It affects evaluations, course evaluations. It affects also faculty's experiences with students. We also have data in one of our papers showing how it impacts faculty's burnout and faculty's own psychological experiences of teaching. Because students are more engaged and motivated, they're more coming to office hours, they're engaging with you in the classroom, they're asking questions because they feel like it's a safe environment to do so, that we find impact on faculty. So if faculty care about their own outcomes, evaluations, and psychological experiences, we have some data on that too. And so, you know, on the website, there's all the papers, you'll have the slides. You know, I think those are places, you know, people like us care about data and care about, you know, those kinds of empirical outcomes, so I would suggest that as a place to go. And I agree, direct-to-student interventions are problematic. They're not enough. I don't think that they're always going to have impact. The context really matters, as we are seeing, and that's why growth mindset culture is really important to be considering now than ever, and the data sort of shows that. Hi.
Hello, good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you so much for that talk, really interesting work and research. The more I'm thinking about this question, the less relevant it feels, but I'm going to ask it anyway.
Please.
So in thinking about your findings and the students who are experiencing the most benefit from these interventions,
Yeah.
I'm sort of thinking about the current environment that we're living in around issues related to equity, inclusion, and
Diversity.
push back against those things. You know, right now, obviously, those things are kind of confined to college admissions, technically. But do you anticipate, or have you received any kind of pushback yourself around the implementation of these interventions, given its
Impacts.
target?
Give it its impacts, yeah.
Right.
Yep. So this is a great question around the political nature of DEI right now in higher education. And I think it's really important to consider. I can tell you that we just finished at Equity Accelerator a massive contract. It was using COVID funds in the state of Texas, where they used federal COVID funds to increase college persistence and completion rates across the board. Originally, it was set aside as a DEI kind of initiative, but when the legislature banned that in Texas, it turned into college completion for all students. And we were the only group that was part of this big project with IHEP, which is a higher education consortium, to really not have to change what we were doing much, because we're focused on this idea. Growth mindset doesn't necessarily like ring the bells of belonging or inclusion or diversity. Though it has these differential impacts, positive impacts, it doesn't sort of have that kind of political nature to it yet. I will say yet. And we do see a main effect in every study that we find, that it does have this raise all boats kind of impact. It just raises some boats, those who are more structurally disadvantaged, raises those boats more than others. And so it does have that positive impact. We can sort of say that with a straight face. And so we haven't come across, in that contract, we were working with 65 2- and 4-year colleges and universities across the state of Texas to engage in some of this practice work. And we were able to do it. We just completed the project at the end of 2023. So even in a state like Texas, we were able to get some of this work done. Not to say that people aren't going to shift around once they see differential outcomes, but if you are a legislator who knows that you have to have college completion rates and you care about college enrollment and completion because of financial reasons, this is something that people can get behind. It's a great question, important to consider today.
We have time for one more question.
Okay.
Thank you.
Hi.
My question is, well, just simply put, the question is involving the RCT and the research, because I think mindset is something that you take a long time to build, and it's probably taking a long time to dissolve, or so-called change mindset. I wonder how long the training involved and how you can make sure that they adhere to the training. So because there are 300 different instructors in different classrooms, different universities, how do you know they're implementing it, and whether it takes a long term to change their mindset, etc. Thank you.
Yeah, great question. So this is a question about implementation and the time it takes to change the practices and the beliefs. So I will say that the Student Experience Project, we kind of took the belief from cognitive dissonance literature and others that we wanted to change practice first and then see if beliefs would come on board. Right? After you engage in some of these practices, you see students actually engaging, you see students actually doing better in your course, disproving maybe some of our long-held beliefs about what students are capable of in the classroom. And so we measured that in faculty attitudes over time, but we did not try to change their beliefs. We tried to change their practices first, and we also knew that there were several places in the term where it was really important that students are perceiving the growth mindset culture. That first day of class where you're saying what the class is about and how to do well, how to be successful there, and who belongs in the class, that's a really important place. So if you can do that, you're shifting the mindset culture pretty quickly for students, and it's being perceived similarly for students there. We see consensus about practice. So to your question of how do we know they're engaged in these practices, we're looking at those student responses to say whether or not the faculty is engaged in some of these practices. We're not just taking faculty's word that they're engaged in some of these practices. We also look at things like their syllabus and their revisions to that as well, so some of these artifacts. We know another big time of change that students are really perceiving the mindset culture is around evaluative situations. So their first big assignment or their first major exam, they're really looking to see how they should make meaning of their performance, whether it's disappointing to them or whether they did better than expected. How do I make meaning of what that means about my abilities and my skills in this area or in this class? And so those practices are really important for creating growth mindset culture pretty quickly and with consensus. So those are the practices we really focused on, to your question.
All right, let's
Great.
thank Dr. Murphy for a wonderful
Thank you so
talk.
much.